Good morning and welcome to episode 6 of the Meraloma Bike Club's Coach's Corner. I'm Alex Spraggs, race director of the Meraloma Bike Club, and with me as always is Paul Moffatt, owner of Velosophy.ca and cycling coach to the Meraloma Bike Club. How are you doing this morning, Paul?
I'm doing great, thanks, Alex. Fresh as a daisy.
That makes one of us so far, anyway. And with us this week, we have another guest, Loma, on the pod today, Marek. How are you doing this morning, Marek?
I'm doing very well, sporting my Meraloma hat, so I'm feeling really peachy.
Looking sharp. Today we're going to talk about incorporating strength and other endurance sports into your cycling training. And we're also going to talk about what signs we should look for that should indicate to us that we need to focus on making sure we're rested and recovered and maybe dial back our training a little bit. And finally, we'll chat with Marek about his Grand Fondo experiences and how to strategize to get the best Fondo time possible. So yeah, Paul, let's start out with incorporating strength training. If you're a cyclist, I think it's important to get strength training, but how should we do that safely and while still maximizing our cycling training effects?
Awesome. Yeah. Let's get stuck into that. By the way, great questions this week. We could probably do a show on each one of these. So I want to just stick to the key points, the most important ones, and I'm sure that will lead to further questions down the line. Strength training is really useful and a good tool to incorporate into your cycling, but it requires a little bit of careful balance. So there should be phases in your training throughout the year, the off season, the peak season, and kind of the transition season as you're coming out from one into the other, right? So ideally, your strength training starts in the off season, which will help your body adapt. And when it's in the off season, it's not as critical that it's so well balanced. In other words, strength training can end up fatiguing your legs quite a lot, and it can upset your training balance. So in the off season, where your training is reduced a little bit, it can be time for you to really hone in on nailing your strength. We'll talk about the foundations or foundation exercises you should be focusing on. And it allows you to kind of build your strength as you go. So if you're experiencing sore legs from training, et cetera, it's not such a big deal because you're doing a lot more base miles. Starting your training now during the peak season is a little bit more of a balancing act. You need to be a little bit more careful because it can interrupt your training and leave your legs a little bit more fatigued. So before we get into the exercises themselves, think about training days. So for now, it wouldn't necessarily be beneficial to do more than 2 strength training sessions a week, especially if you already have about 2 or 3 good challenging cycling workouts a week. And I would split them up into 2 days. I would do an upper body and a core day and a lower body and accessories day, which could be some more core work, or it could be things that you want to work on, like your guns, do the biceps and triceps, etc. Just stuff that's not really going to interfere with it. So when it comes to upper body stuff, you kind of have a la carte because it's not going to interfere with the cycling itself. It may cause some systematic fatigue, like throughout your body, but it's not going to leave your legs gutted for cycling training, essentially. So that I often will have my upper body day just before a high intensity cycling day or after, because I know they're not going to interfere with each other. Whereas my leg day, I'm going to either do that before a kind of a base miles ride. So if I do a lot of big zone 1 rides on the weekend, I know I can do that a day or 2 before that ride, or directly after it, because on those days I'm not putting out high power, I'm not looking to do climbing, I'm just doing a lower intensity but long duration ride. So it's okay for me to go into that with maybe slightly fatigued legs. So that really depends on the rider and their schedule, how that's going to work. Some people prefer to get their leg training in early in the week, and some people prefer to get it in just before the weekend, before the long duration ride. So we're not really going to worry about that. All I'm going to recommend is that you space things out. Just like our theme in the last few weeks is, you want to balance training and fatigue. goal isn't to take heavy legs into training. And that's not necessarily a good indication that your training is working. That's been a repeated theme now. So let's move on to the types of exercises you can use. So now the fitness industry is full of workouts and stuff for you to do, but I would say that there's only a small percentage that you really need to become a better cyclist. Every fitness guru, men's health or women's health fitness thing has got like the best 5 exercise for cyclists. Now, my issue is that most of those are developed by personal trainers who have no cycling experience. And if you're a track cyclist, I'm going to give you a completely different weight training program to someone who's training for fondos, or someone who's a triathlete, or someone who's, there's all these factors to take into it. So there isn't one best exercise for a cyclist. However, there are some foundation exercises that all cyclists can do that will not only improve your cycling, but just improve your day-to-day functioning. Basically stuff that we should all, movements that we should all have inherently in us. And one would be a full range squat, right? So being able to maintain a nice neutral spine where your spine is fairly upright, and when you do your squat, you're not leaning forward too much. It's just having a nice natural deviation to it, and that you're able to get your hips underneath your knees. In other words, your thighs get at least a parallel or deeper. So before you go adding lots of weight in, assess the quality of your squat. Are you able to get that range? If you can't get that range yet and you're not able to get parallel or deeper, that's where you could spend some really useful time, is doing some mobility work, following with stretching and things like that before your workouts, to see if you can improve that range of motion. Because if you can't get that deep, you're not going to be able to access all the muscles you want for your cycling. So that's some nice low-hanging fruit. It's if that's the stage you're at, then that's not going to impede your cycling too much if you focus a lot of time there. So you could do that multiple times a week. So let's say you've moved past that phase and you have good range of motion. You're not super tight. I know most of us are. We'll all have tight hip flexors and tight hammies and tight glutes from all the cycling you're doing. But let's say you've moved past that phase, you've got good range of motion. A good squat is important. Go easy on the weights at first. And if it's this time of season, focus on a higher rep range and don't train to failure. So often when you come from a weight training background, a PT or a weight training coach will teach you how to train to failure. So 8 to 12 rep range, let's say they're using, which would be considered a hypertrophy weight range. They'd get you to do your first set till you felt like you have 1 or 2 reps. So let's say you were getting close to failure around 9 reps. Second set, they would probably get you to match that. You could hit 9, but you're starting to struggle. And then on your third set, they train you to failure, where you can't get the bar off your chest or you can't get the bar up by yourself necessarily, or you're really struggling to get it up. That would be your point of failure. This time of season, there's not much value to training like that, because you're just going to dig yourself a deep hole and you're not going to have any fun getting back on your bike, especially if it's your first weight training session. So we'll talk about that as well, because you've got to be careful of something called DOMs. So I would focus more on a rep range that's high, say 10 to 15, where the quality of the movement is really high. So your squats are controlled, you can go down nice and slow and you don't lose any balance. You're symmetrical. In other words, there's no twisting or shifting your weight to one leg. That would be something to really address. So that's your squat taken care of. Then you want a hip hinge movement like a deadlift or a good morning, where you're bending from the hips and you're able to keep your spine flat. Deadlifts are great for this, but it takes a while for new weight training participants to really learn that movement properly, where they're using their glutes. So that one would be very important, that you have good hamstring flexibility and that you're able to keep your weight on your heels. In fact, with squatting as well, we want to use your heels in that one too. So if you notice that your heels are coming up off the ground because you don't have good calf flexibility, you can put a little block underneath your heel, which you'll notice right away your depth changes immediately, because often if you have tight calves or tight ankles, that will limit your squats quite a lot. So that's like a little hack around that one. Okay, so we got a squat movement, we've got a deadlift movement, so that's going to work your posterior chain. Then you want to do either a unilateral exercise or a single leg exercise. So what that means is something where you're separating left and right a little bit. So for example, a lunge, that would be separate loading left and right. They're doing different tasks, and then you check it out on the other side. Again, symmetry is important. You want the movements to look the same on both legs, and you want the number of reps to be the same. So the first thing to do when you're doing single leg or unilateral exercises, establish your weaker leg. That one will Sorry about that. So yeah, once you find your weak leg, let that determine the reps for both sides. There's no point in making a strong side stronger. We want the weaker side to catch up. And often if you do catch a weaker side and you also see asymmetries in your squats, like you're twisting to one side, leaning to one side, this will help potentially to even those asymmetries out there as well. So if I can only do 6 on my left, but I could do more on my right, then I do 6 on both sides irrespective. You don't need to train that right side any harder. It's going to be more maintenance for the strong side and development on the left side. Now I like to maximize my time when I do workouts. So I usually only do 3 or 4 leg exercises, but to get more out of the day, I'll complement it with some core exercises in between during the rest periods to maximize my workout time. So I'll do 1 set of squats, I'll do 1 set of planks, and go back and forth until I've done 3 sets of each. So planking movements are great, side planks. Don't worry about doing crunches, because for most of our cyclists, we spend far too much time in that flex position with our shoulders round us. So we actually want to spend time on your upper body stuff doing the opposite. So another exercise you may want to do, which most people don't think of as a core exercise, but it's going to help your postural muscles, would be things like a rocket man. So where you're lying face down on your belly button, and then you pick your head up. So from the side, it would look like this. So imagine my floor is here. I'm going to pull my head back. I'm going to lift my shoulders off the ground and pinch my shoulder blades and pull my hands back. So my hands are doing this movement, and I'm swinging back. From the top, it looks like you're making a rocket man sort of shape with your body. So just a handful of those. It's not to train to failure, just like anything else, just to get your back stimulated and undo some of the stuff that you're doing working at the desk and cycling all the time. So then for upper body, and then we'll move swiftly on. My basic principles are, I don't give you too much detail. You do the exercises that are fun and you enjoy, but equal out your pulling and your pushing movements, right? For cyclists, especially, most of your anterior muscle groups are short and tight. Rounded shoulders, tight abs, tight core. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're strong. They could be weak and tight as well. But we need to undo that, right? So spending at least as much time doing pulling movements like rows, some pull-ups, anything that's going to pull your shoulders back and retract will help undo some of those things that we're getting between working sedentary jobs and riding on your bicycle. So yeah, like I said, dumbbell rows, barbell rows, work in various angles. If you're at a gym and you have cable machines, there's tons of variations you can do there. For pushing exercise, nothing beats a good push-up. If you have a great push-up, that's a super functional movement. I used to think that the bench press was the be-all and end-all. It pales in comparison to a good weighted push-up. Not to say that if you enjoy doing bench press, go for it, for sure. But having the basics of a push-up has now become one of the key elements in a fitness screen. So it basically depicts natural functional movement. So we should all be able to pick ourselves up off the ground, essentially. Yeah, and then a nice shoulder press. So the other thing I like to use my exercise for, and then we'll kind of like stop the segment here, is they help me to see what condition my body is in. So I like to do a shoulder press where you have your arm in front of your body, not off to the side and not at an angle. And I'm just very strict, and I like to just do a nice strict press with a light weight. And you'd be surprised how hard it is to do a lightweight for high repetitions, keeping your elbow facing a wall in front of you. And what you'll find is it will illuminate all your tightnesses. So if you find like your head is moving to your ear, it's often tightness or at least dominant trap muscles. Or if you get to here and you can't extend your elbow properly, you could have tight traps, tight lats, or tight chest muscles. So it can direct your mobility work by just doing some functional movements. And that's one of the things I use with my clients is the squat and the deadlift to see where they're tight. If someone's complaining about their back when we do an easy deadlift and they're rounding out their back, I know that they've probably got tight hamstrings. So we'll go back, have a look at that, stretch them out. And if their movement improves afterwards, that's where our time should be spent. Okay. All right, so that's a lot of information at once. Should we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, sure. And yeah, if anyone wants to go in deeper into that, send your questions this way, and we can open up, unpack one of those a little more deeply. But for now, let's move on and talk about getting other endurance training into our work. So we're generally, I think for cyclists, oftentimes we sometimes like to run or maybe swim. Hopefully not all three, because that would make you a triathlete, and
Yeah.
I don't like those when we're cyclists. So
It's a different club for that.
yeah. But yeah, so how should we incorporate that into our, just on a more general stage? Is it okay to incorporate it? If our focus is on cycling, how many days can we do those other things?
Right. Yeah, and that's a great question, right? It all comes down to your goals, essentially. Like, how ambitious are you being with your cycling goals? If your goal is just to complete your first Fondo, then you could probably do more of those activities, right? If your goal is more, I want to race, I am focused on placing, you're starting to direct a lot more focus towards your cycling, right? So you're going to need more emphasis on that. So it's going to close up your training time quite a bit. And then you have to think, is what I'm doing on the side helping me towards my goal, or is it taking me away? How important is it to me? So if you really, really love running and you're like, look, I have to keep some running in there, it's just my favorite thing in the world, absolutely, you should do that. Again, it's about balancing it so it doesn't affect your training, right? So if you're used to running big distances, maybe you can reduce the volume a little bit and reduce the intensity. So do flatter runs or trail runs, something that's soft and easy on your knees, something that's easy to recover from, so that the quality of your cycling training isn't impacted. You don't want to take heavy legs, just like strength training, same thing. You don't want to take heavy legs into those days, right? For amateur athletes, there is some evidence to show that cross-training, which includes strength, so strength training, doing a little bit of running, swimming would definitely be one that I could say you could do quite well without impacting your fatigue too much. Is evidence to show that it can be very valuable to your training, because it can help you to work on other things that your cycling and helps you day to day. So if you just feel better generally, health-wise, that's going to play into better cycling, or at least more motivation. At least from a placebo effect, your mind will be, you'll have more motivation, you'll be clearer, and your training will improve that way. So again, the principles are the same. Where you put your workouts is really important. So don't put your run the day before a high intensity day, maybe do it afterwards. If cycling is the most important thing, then it's not necessarily a terrible thing to be running on tired legs versus cycling on tired legs. And then scale those workouts proportionally. So if we don't want to cause too much fatigue, run in a way that you know you're going to be able to recover from really quickly. Now, swimming, that if you use that as an aerobic type swimming activity, where you're just doing like lower intensity and just doing like, I don't know enough about swimming to make any recommendations here, but if I'm using the same principles as cycling, if you're doing like a 60 to 90 minute sort of swim routine where the intensity is around or slightly above zone 1, I don't think it's going to impede your training that much, right? Still your cardiovascular system is not putting too much stress through the muscles. Not to say that swimming is distressing for anyone who's a swimmer out there. Please don't attack me. I know that swimming can be very taxing, but swim in a way that's going to facilitate your recovery. So I don't know if anyone out there is familiar with Richie Port. Richie Port's a rider for BMC, and he's a Grand Tour rider in Tour de France. He's their lead rider. He does a lot of swimming, especially in the off season. He does it in the off season because it helps to build his base miles without increasing his fatigue. He uses it almost as a fatigue reducing, facilitating activity. So that's really, really cool, really unique. I think there's a lot of valuable things that you can learn from that. So like swimming can teach you good breathing techniques and how to pace. So in terms of pacing tools, that's great. Imagine applying the same breathing stroke or mechanism that you do in the pool while you're doing a freestyle to climbing up a hill, and you can imagine what kind of effect that would have for a rider. It would probably have some very beneficial things in teaching them pacing and getting enough oxygen while they're riding. So yes, cross-training could definitely work there, but be careful how you do it. So maybe right now, this time of season, if you're aiming to peak, only one other day is dedicated to cross-training. In the off season, maybe you can do 2 trail runs or a run and a swim, and still have 2 to 3 good riding sessions in there as well. So just think about what phase you're in and what your goals are. How important is it to you perform on your bike? If it's really important, then we need to get a bit more specific. Most of your training should be on the bike.
Fantastic. And I think we're going to save the next question, which was going to be about rest, for another day, because I think we can probably get a lot into that. And I know that there's a lot of different things we can look at to kind of indicate that. So in the interest of time, we'll save that for next week. And Marek, let's bring Marek into the conversation. So Marek, I know you have a long experience in endurance sports, and so I was hoping you might be able to just talk a little bit about your Gran Fondo experiences and some that were particularly memorable, and then we'll get into your question about strategizing for pacing a Gran Fondo.
Great, thank you very much. It's great to be on the Coaches Corner this week. I've been enjoying them so far, and hopefully people enjoy this one as much. So I got into Fondo style racing about 40 years ago. It wasn't called Fondo back then, but I was living in Cape Town at the time, and somebody had this wise idea that he should actually get people involved in cycling that weren't cyclists. So these people that recreationally used to cycle around, they organized an event called the Argus Cycle Tour. It was sponsored by the local newspaper, and it went around the Cape Peninsula, a total of 104 kilometers. That race has now grown into quite an epic. They get about 40,000 people doing it. I think Paul may have done it himself, since he was in South Africa at one point, and maybe a Loma's destination race at some point. Anyway, this here picture that you should be seeing is of me starting the race in 1980. So I'm on a steel frame bike, which has all of 10 speeds, two cogs up front and 5 at the back. That was state of the art then. You'll notice very few people are wearing any type of helmet. We all seem to have about 1 water bottle and no nutrition on our bikes, but we still managed to get around in about 30 to 35 kilometers per hour. This was not supposed to be a race, but of course, as with Fondos, people did start to race. My tactics at the time used to involve taking off up the first hill, which was about 4 or 5 kilometers, as fast as possible to get with as fast as possible a group as you could. The next 20 kilometers went along a highway that kind of winds its way, and if you're in a group of 40 or 50 people, you can just zip along at 40 kilometers an hour without even trying. And then the roads start to get a little narrower, hills start to go up, and inevitably you'll drop off the back of the groups at some point when somebody puts in a surge, and then you're stuck in no man's land, out of breath, and the rest of the race can be awfully painful. So the question out of all of that is, if I want to race to Whistler in the Whistler Fondo, for example, and get there as fast as possible, how do I figure that out? What group do I go with? How do I avoid going with so slow a group that I'm pulling them and they're getting all the benefit of me, versus going out way too fast up Taylor Way and blowing up as you go through Squamish and really crawling into Whistler? Paul, any ideas?
A really interesting and complex question. It'd be like asking me to go to the casino for you and try and pick the winner. I guess what you're talking about is tactics. You'll kind of learn those as you get more experience, because you need to see things play out and then decide what tactics to adopt to do that. So there's no one particular way. So I know you're looking for a black and white answer here, and I don't really have one. But we'll talk about what you did and like what would have been a better tactic, and how to spot other things that may help your riding too. One thing that's been a repeated theme with riders who tend to feel like they could have done better, when I have chats with them, they tend to say the same thing that you did is that they went out too hard in the start. They tried to grab onto a really fast group. We all get caught up with that concept of, I need to get into a fast group. Now, I would say it's something like our Whistler Fondo. It is really important to get help from a group of some sort, because there's so much riding to do. So sharing the load is super important. But my question is, do you want to finish strong or do you want to start strong? Because you kind of have to pick one or the other. So my guys, King of the Mountain guys, who are pretty strong guys, their egos are pretty high. And some of the caliber of riders in the Whistler Fondo are elite 1, 2, semi-professional North Americans. But seeing as they're at the top of my group, they think they can hang with anybody. And from last year's Fondo, when we go up Taylor Way, it's basically like an explosion. Like people are going way over their abilities to just stay with the front group. And a handful of my riders did the same thing. They're like, oh, if we can stay with these guys, we'll be with the strong guys and we'll be able to be faster this year. So they dug really deep for Taylor Way and went well beyond their own abilities, managed to stick with the front group for a little bit, but because of how hard they went at that point, they were never able to fully recover. By the time they got to the next hill, Britannia Beach and Furry Creek, well, they had really blown their matches. And that's really a thing to think about. Is we always hear people say that is like, oh, how many matches did you burn? Or, watch out for going too hard. You're going to burn too many matches. Each of us inherently has a matchbox full of like climbing legs, if you will, and you only get so many. So where do you want to spend those? For me, I'd rather spend them at Brackendale or closer to the finish line, because that's where I'm going to make the most difference in terms of placing. If I'm struggling to get up Brackendale because I burned all my matches at the start, well, my race is starting to go backwards very quickly. So knowing yourself and managing your energy, you can go pretty hard up Taylor Way, but you can't dig super deep. So as you guys are starting to learn about your training and you're starting to learn about percentages of FTP and things like that, you'll start to know what you can do and how long you can do it for and how many times you can do it. So if you notice, the C group workouts that we've been giving, they're slightly easier than some of the other ones, but I've gradually progressed how many repetitions they're doing on their hill climb. So they went from 3 to 4, and some of them are now 5, so it's starting to match the other groups. And that's really important, being able to repeat the same effort over and over. So once you can do that, then if you're doing, say, 130% FTP, you're not going to be able to do that for very long. So if you're doing higher than that on the base of Taylor Way, well, guess what? You still got 110 kilometers of riding to do. So you might want to scale that back and save some of those matches. A little trick you can use, though, if you want to try to stay with the main group without without burning matches, is doing something called sag climbing. So Alex and I have talked about this a few times. So let's say get out of Stanley Park, you're with the front group, gradually make your way to the front of the group, even if you feel like you have no place being at the front. Okay, so you make your way to the front where it's easy to do so. Don't burn any matches, just try and use other riders, draft your way up. When you're close to the front, as you get to tail away, you allow yourself to drop towards the back of the group slowly, using your own energy management practices to get there. So I will limit myself to say 120% of my FTP. So I won't climb over 400 or so watts. As I fall back, I start to drop towards the back of the group, but I never leave the group. The guys at the front are putting out considerably more power than me because they're moving past me, but I'm not, and I haven't lost the group, and hopefully I'm still with them as we get onto the highway exit. That way I save my matches, I'm still with the fast group, and I can work with them, right? Fantastic. Now, if I'm with that group and we start to draft, and I'm still, so using your threshold numbers, so if you've tested your FTP, if you're riding close to your FTP or above your FTP while you're in the group, that group is too strong for you. You're just going to blow up. You just have to kind of recognize that and let the next group come through. You have to find a group that helps you manage your energy. You shouldn't be going over your limit to stay with a group. That is going to really blow you up and you're going to have a slow Fondo-type. So that's kind of what happened to my guys. They reached too deep. They were in a group that was a little bit too advanced for them. And they ended up with a slower Fondo time last year than the previous year, even though they were fitter this time around. So knowing your abilities, knowing how to recognize when a group is just right for you. Now, something that you sent us in the notes, Marek, was like, how do you make sure that you're in a group that's not too easy or drafting? Well, I would say that is still a better scenario than riding by yourself, because I've been in that situation a couple times and the next group isn't that far away. So if you're the strongest climber in that group, you can just use that group to save your energy to the bottom of the next climb and catch the next group up, right? But in a race like Whistler Fondo, the race really doesn't start until after Squamish. So how I would pace it is do your best to conserve as much of your FTP as possible until you get to Brackendale. So if you don't have to climb harder than you need to, don't. If you don't have to be in a group that's faster than you can go, don't do that. Because once you get to Brackendale, you see everyone who's overreached goes out the back door. And that's when you start, the drafting effect is very limited. And your energy reserves are really important at that point. Okay, so if you're high energy and you've managed your energy well, you'll catch multiple groups on Brackendale and pass that. And there are sections after Brackendale where you can really work with a group of 4 or 5 people and make your way back on. Last year, for example, I got dropped from the lead group just after Brackendale because I expended a bit too much on Ferry Creek and Britannia Beach, trying to keep up with these young lads who are semi-pros. But a group of 6 of us formed after Brackendale, and we worked together and we caught back onto the lead group and we finished with them. So we were still able to catch them later on, but we all had to recognize we were out of our league at that point, and we needed to work together to make that happen. So if we had tried to chase the lead group down as individuals, we never would have made it. So.
Okay, thank you. I think my takeaways from that are learn your power levels, yeah, and stick to them probably.
Yeah. Yeah,
I suspect the second thing is practice. You know, enter lots of fondos, and you get more experience, and you'll have bad ones and good ones, and make sure your bad ones are on the unimportant ones, and your good ones are on the important ones.
Absolutely, yeah. Practice makes perfect, right? So, and there's a lot of cool little practical things you can do. So you can mimic your Ferry Creek and Britannia Beach efforts. So go back to your Whistler Fondos past, see how long those climbs were, and try to see if you can match those efforts and those durations and see how many times you can do that, right? That will be a good tester for you. And then doing rides where you try not to try not to coast or unclip and take unnecessary breaks for the same amount of time you intend to do your Whistler Fondo in. Because just building up that endurance can be really important for you. If you don't have to stop, that could save you 10, 20 minutes on your Fondo time right there. So, yeah.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Marek. It's been another great episode, hopefully, of Coach's Corner. And Paul, I'll see you again next week. And Marek, I'll see you out on the road.
Yep, perfect. Thank you very much.
Good to see you, Marek.
Bye.
Take care, guys.